Hello, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee's online worship service. I'm Reverend Dina McFeeters, and I'm honored to serve as Associate Minister. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all that you are carrying with you today and all that your heart longs to set down. We'd like to pay a special welcome to guests joining us today. If you're visiting for the first time or joining us from afar, why don't you say hello in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from? I welcome you to our worship service today by inviting you to repeat our mission after me. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. Let's return to our beloved sanctuary for the lighting of the flaming chalice, symbol of Unitarian Universalism.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Mulvey, and I'm honored to be your worship associate for today. I'll be sharing this reading with you. One of our religious ancestors, the Reverend Dr. Florence Buck, was one of the first women ministers in America who came to ministry as a second career. First, she was a school teacher, then a principal. She had also tutored seminary students. Later, she was a parish minister and was so skilled at building churches and looking at education for children, youth, and young adults as the way to grow our faith that the American Unitarian Association hired her to be in charge of training all religious educators in our congregations. The following is excerpted from one of her addresses to the annual conference of Unitarian instructors in faith formation, titled Religious Education for Democracy. This address was given at the annual meeting on May 22nd, 1919, by the Reverend Dr. Florence Buck. We are trying to cultivate right responses to the situations which life itself presents. It is necessary, first of all, that we get clearly in our mind real aim in the church school. It is threefold. I shall indicate the parts of it by three short, familiar words as aids to the memory. Know, be, do. 1. Our first aim is that our pupils shall know some of the things needful about religion. This is the knowledge aim of our school. 2. Our second aim is that they shall be the best sort of people. This is the character aim. 3. Our third aim is that they shall do the best they know. This is the right conduct and service aim. Let me put this statement in more scientific terms. 1. Our first aim is that the pupils shall gain fruitful knowledge. We may not try to impart all knowledge, and in choosing what we would have them know, we must seek that which is valuable for conduct in life. 2. We seek to develop right attitudes of mind and spirit. This is, as we all know, one of the best elements of a liberal faith. One's bent of mind, one's interests and loyalties, one's desires for truth are the attitudes which determine what character shall be. Religious instruction, which seeks to develop attitudes, is very different from that which seeks merely to impart rules of life and knowledge of creeds. 3. Out of our turmoil in recent years, and here she's referring to World War I. Three fundamental principles have become clear. One, right response is the true basis of human association. Here she's emphasizing the importance of community and the interconnected web. Two, moral obligations rest upon nations as well as upon individuals. Three, the weak must be protected against the aggressions of the strong. Can you see which UU principles she was foreshadowing? She continues. Now, these are essentially religious principles. Every great religious teacher has declared them. They formed the essential message of the Hebrew prophets, especially of the greatest of them all, the founder of Christianity. These principles apply both to governments and to associated groups within governments, that is, to the whole of life. They are religion in action. They are the core of democracy. Taking all aspects of life as religious inspiration, Reverend Dr. Florence Buck welcomed insights from science and encouraged people to find divine inspiration from their hearts and souls. In a sermon she gave in Cleveland, The Divineness of Common Things, she taught that the commonplaces of life, the things that are near and familiar, have lessons to teach us, have revelations of God to make human hearts. She cautioned that science is no threat to God's revelation in nature. Rather, nature invites communion with God. Scripture teaches that the place on which we stand is holy ground. Reverend Dr. Florence Buck frequently taught that our progressive Unitarian faith was not one of just inspirational words, but instead a faith of putting religion in action, saying, we are trying to cultivate right responses to the situations which life itself presents. The weak must be protected against the aggressions of the strong.
Divine, 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 and it's all mine, it's mine, it's mine. Divine, 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 it makes my heart shine. Boom, 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 so divine, divine, so divine, divine, so divine, and it's all mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's so mine, the tree, divine, 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 it makes my heart shine. Boom, 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 divine, so divine, divine, so divine, divine, so divine, and it's all mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, the tree, divine, so divine, 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 it makes my heart shine. Mystery of life.
What did it feel like to be Florence Buck? What did it feel like to take her ideas and say, "Buck it"? Between seminary and serving at Bradford Unitarian Universalist in Kenosha, Wisconsin, I became interested in a queer woman minister that served Bradford UU from 1901 to 1910. I liked the idea of lifting up someone rumored to be a lesbian. I didn't expect to find a friend or mentor in our historical ancestor. Now I find myself thinking, how did Florence Buck feel?
She has never been given credit for how influential she was in religious education as a whole, in women's rights, as one of the first queer woman ministers, nor has she been given credit much at all in Unitarian Universalist history. In my research, I discovered that Reverend Buck was addressing anti-racist ideas when most people barely acknowledged the topic. I learned Reverend Buck was even teaching children religious education in Black Baptist churches in a time of lynchings and Jim Crow laws, something that would have been very odd for a Universalist or a Unitarian minister to be doing. I am personally inspired by her messages from 100 years ago, and while I hope Unitarian Universalists will embrace her ideas today, I find myself often wondering, what did Florence feel like? In 1889, Florence Buck discovered Unitarianism, and she also discovered Reverend Marian Murdoch. In my research, I gathered evidence that these women were not just sisterly friends, but intimate queer partners. From the very beginning, they shared travels, their home, education, and finances. In Reverend Marian Murdoch's letters of introduction of Florence Buck into ministry, she was introducing him to the very powerful and influential Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones. And in the first letter, the intimacy and affection that Marian Murdoch has for Florence Buck is clear. At first, Jones thinks that Buck must be a gentleman. And once this was cleared up in letters back and forth, we see Murdoch requesting a cozy room in a faraway farmhouse for the two women to share at the religious education institutes. Did that feel daring? Did it feel secretive? Did it feel like they were simply friends? Reverend Buck's ideas were big from the start. She was writing in 1889 about the need for us to have Unitarian megachurches, and she was bucking the trend of only having small churches. She was writing to Unitarian leadership in Boston about the importance of sharing our message of liberal Christianity. Buck also envisioned robust education programs in our churches, and at one of her pastorates in California, she told the board if they really wanted to build the church from the ground up, they should hire a qualified religious educator before hiring a minister. How frustrating it must have been to tell her board of trustees over and over that investing in religious education was a key to growing a church. I came to realize many ideas we attribute to religious educator Sophia Faz in our faith are rooted in Florence Buck theology. Now, why is that? Buck's writing is more difficult to access. Little of it is credited under her name, but only accessible after tracing where she was and looking at documents that came out of those events. In one address, Florence Buck makes an appeal to stop Unitarians from supporting missionaries. Stop aiming for conversions of other people's faith to our own, and not to think of ourselves as superior to other faiths or nations. Can you imagine how angry she must have been when she happened upon colleagues, male colleagues, who were talking about how much smarter they were than Catholics or Baptists? In her 1919 address, Religious Education for Democracy, she says, "Perhaps most of us can remember the ways of making an appeal for missions which were in vogue in the past. The horrors of the practice and worship and beliefs that there were heathen who were presented in startling contrast to the excellence of our own faith. We are presented aliens at their worst," she says, "ourselves at our best." This method did make us eager to help, but also cultivates an unwarranted sense of superiority, preventing any real sense of human brotherhood. I think this is important to remember for us in Unitarian Universalist churches because we say that we are a faith that welcomes many theologies. But sometimes, if we have been hurt by another faith or a religion that we grew up with, we can be rather full of ourselves. I know I have been sometimes in the past. But you know what? I'm here to welcome all and many theologies. I have to wonder, too, if Reverend Buck was speaking to the American Indian boarding schools, known more recently as American or Canadian Indian residential schools. They were established from about the mid-17th century to the early 20th centuries, and they were there trying to civilize or assimilate Native American children into a European white culture. It's important to also remember that Unitarians undertook at least 3 times to educate the Indians. There was one in working with the Chippewa and Ojibwe in Minnesota in 1855. That one failed due to lack of funding. In 1871, President Grant assigned the Unitarians responsibility of education on the Utes Reservation near White River, Colorado. That attempt was 1885. And then in 1886, the American Unitarian Association, the AUA, established a boarding school on the Crow Reservation in Montana called the Montana Industrial School for Indians. Reverend Buck continues, religion is not to blame alone for this. Songs and stories, articles in our common speech, and life tended and still tend to cultivate in us attitudes of the Pharisee who thanks God he is not as other men. That sentiment of genders and races being equal and all deserving of a liberal faith education was apparent in Reverend Buck's book, The Story of Jesus, where she included song lyrics about welcoming all from all races and nations. Those were written before World War I. The more I delved into Buck's teachings, the more I realized how revolutionary she was in her time. And then I realized how alone she must have felt. In this era of Jim Crow laws and separate bathrooms and entrances, what did it feel like to walk as she traveled to make speeches all over? Throughout Reverend Buck's writings, she emphasizes boys and girls being educated, not only for religious reasons, but also for developing right attitudes of the mind and the spirit. This, we all know, is one of the essential elements of a liberal faith, she writes. Reverend Buck was always ready to advocate for the underserved, for equal treatment for all, and education for all people in all walks of life. She must have been so angry that other women didn't have access to the vote or the advanced education that she held. I wonder, too, how it felt to know she was more educated and more experienced than her male colleagues, and more educated and more experienced than her boss at the AUA. Buck was far more accomplished than most ministers. She had been a teacher and then promoted to being a principal. She already had her master's degree and postgraduate work before entering seminary and then ministry. In fact, she was so well versed in Latin and Greek, she tutored Baptist and Methodist seminary students before she ever heard of Unitarianism. She had more advanced degree work than most of her colleagues, more than Marion, her partner, more than Jenkins Lloyd Jones, and more than then American Unitarian Association, the AUA, President Reverend Samuel Eliot. By the time Buck was to be hired by him to be the associate secretary for the AUA for education, she had numerous degrees, and she'd been one of the first women, if not the first woman, to do postgraduate work at the seminary at Oxford after studying at Meadville Lombard Theological School. Reverend Buck was able to continue her ministry of education for all, letting some of her suffrage lectures take a back seat when she took that job as the first associate secretary of the AUA's Department of Education in 1912. During her tenure, Reverend Buck wrote key religious education materials and columns, and she led tons of religious education institutes or conferences. Her methods included art and music and drama in teaching religious education. That was revolutionary at the time. People didn't even use pictures to teach. She used pictures, songs, and wrote pageants and plays, educating young adults up to age 35 and teaching in the outdoors. It doesn't seem like an unusual concept today to perhaps be in nature while you're teaching religious education, but we have to imagine this time of segregation and only about 20% of children attending school. Buck's church programs were regularly attended by large groups of not yet members. From children to young adults, new families, they were seen as means of helping them to better themselves and to build communities. Buck's ideas were not only radical, I would even say she was queering education and faith formation. Queering meaning doing it differently, looking at it through a different lens. Though unheard of at the time, Reverend Buck made headlines when she offered a proper funeral for a man who was known as an alcoholic. A theme of treating all with inherent worth and dignity is illustrated in her preaching, stating, "One's goodness should not only be shown alone by the way he treats his family, his neighbors, and his personal friends or associates, but also by the way he treats those more remote, the worker, the poor, the foreigner, and yes, even the criminal and outcast," she states. Not only did Reverend Buck queer our faith by turning typical ways of doing things over, she herself saw no reason to bend to the conventions of marrying a man or being alone. As intimate life partners, the Reverends Buck and Murdoch traveled the globe, and they worked in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, California, and Massachusetts during their 35 years together. Their intention from the start was, quote, "to always remain together, and the church that calls one must call the other." However, Cleveland, Ohio was the only time the women held a co-ministry. This too is revolutionary. I look at how many congregations have started to move to co-ministry practices. The novelty of having two women preachers attracted large crowds in Cleveland at first. One reporter asked them if it took two women to make up one male minister. Reverend Buck corrected the reporter, explaining how two ministers meant more than twice the diversity and capacity. I know that when I was first dating women, I worried about who would find out. I was afraid I would be hurt, and I had feelings that even after I had been in a relationship with a woman for decades, that those things would still happen. And I still worry about it when I introduce myself as queer. And yet, for me, time has helped ease some of that fear. But what about you, Florence? Were you always afraid of bucking the system, but you did it anyway? Florence Buck's list of first is long. She was the first person to receive an honorary doctorate at Meadville, given to a woman. She was the first woman to preach at the famous King's Chapel, the first to create young adult youth RE, teaching outdoors as well, the first woman to edit the Beacon hymnal, the first director of the religious institutes employed by the AUA, but called associate secretary even though she led the department. She was author of The Story of Jesus and other pedagogical works. And that's a huge list. And I have to wonder, Florence, did you do all that? Did you overcompensate so that no one would know how afraid you were? Did you accomplish more because others around you might have looked down on you and you wanted to be recognized and promoted the way men around you were? Did your voice shake when you offered wise advice that no one paid attention to? I wonder if you felt alone, Florence. I wonder if you ever feel alone like that. I see you. Unitarian Universalism sees you. Sadly, Buck died of typhoid fever in 1925 when she was 65 years old. And in papers in her ministry file, I found a small card. It was a note from Reverend Samuel O. Weems, a historian and minister to 5 Black Baptist churches in Boston. He wrote to the AUA to let them know they were naming a new chapel in honor of Florence Buck for all the time she spent in his 8 churches teaching children in Black neighborhoods in Boston. What was it like for Florence to go find children so eager for her message that she entered those churches but told no one? Did you feel like you were conducting yourself with right action? I bet you did, Florence. But I know, too, you loved people. You delighted in embracing new ways and learning new cultures, and I am proud that you didn't feel the need to boast about what you did. You just saw a need and took care of it. I think about this prim and proper lady with golden hair walking into Black neighborhoods and Black churches with her newspaper under her arm, perhaps having read about a recent lynching or the anti-Semitism post-World War I. Florence Buck believed everyone deserved liberal Christianity and education as a form of liberation. Yet board minutes where Reverend Dr. Florence Buck was a pastor are full of folks that thought a man should deliver these messages. In fact, they showed her that she was worth less by paying her a fraction of what a male minister would be paid. They gave her little credit. Her name was rarely attributed to her accomplishments. How did you feel, Florence? Reverend Buck was willing to turn every notion of how to be a minister, how to educate, and even who to admire on its head. She was queering our faith over 100 years ago. Religion in action is the core of democracy. It is the core of our faith. And sometimes it feels lonely acting on that. You may never get the credit. You may live in fear doing it. Yet Reverend Dr. Florence Buck did that every day, and I have to think she just said to herself, "Buck it. Buck the patriarchy, buck the misogyny, buck the homophobia." And I say thank you, Florence, for saying buck it. And I invite all of you to buck it when you feel alone in doing right conduct, right service, and being of right character. Think about her as you inspire others to act on our faith.
Dear ones, I'll leave you with these closing words by Arthur Foote. May peace dwell within our hearts and understanding in our minds. May courage steel our wills and love of truth forever guide us. May it be so.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know